On behalf of ANUISA, saya Christine Claudia ingin mengucapkan terima kasih banyak sudah menyempatkan waktu untuk berada di sini sore-sore di hari Jumat. Udah nggak sabar ya, Friday night is coming, the weekend is coming, but you spend your time over here. But before we begin, I would like to firstly acknowledge the Nganowal people who are the traditional custodians of this land, which we are meeting, and pay respect to the elders of the Nganowal nation, both past, present, and also emerging. Once again, saya Christine Claudia, senang sekali menemani kehadiran tamu-tamu spesial kita hari ini. Nanti kita akan berkenalan lebih lanjut. Today's session is very special because we will explore a topic that is very close to many of us, students and young professionals. Apalagi kebetulan di ANU banyak sekali teman-teman yang belajar di ANU adalah teman-teman yang sedang menempuh master degree. Dan saya yakin juga teman-teman di sini kebetulan banyak yang master degree, so we will definitely get so much insights from our speaker today. Buat teman-teman yang bercita-cita untuk menjadi peneliti atau mungkin analis kebijakan atau bahkan bekerja di think tank internasional, sesi ini akan memberikan banyak sekali insight yang berharga dan tentunya insider tips ya, Mas, untuk hari ini. Also, we're very happy karena ini merupakan ANUISA Expert Series yang terakhir. So we have done 4 ANUISA Expert Series dari yang teknologi hingga hari ini tentang policy analysis. So, but before we begin, I would like to firstly, before we dive in, let's hear some opening remarks from the person who has worked so hard to bring us all together over here, Kak Intan Permatasari. She is currently pursuing her Master of Energy Change at the Australian National University, and we're so grateful she has taken the time to be with us today. Kak Intan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you so much, Mas Gatra, for udah mau datang ke acara ANUISA ini. So this is our last ANUISA Expert Series for this term. Because, as you maybe already know, ANUISA Expert Series is a new program from ANUISA 2025 under the Personal and Professional Development Division, which is led by Hanif, and consists of Riza, Kristen, and Kak Aji. We are so glad to have this division, and hopefully lewat program ini kita semua bisa belajar dari orang-orang yang sudah berkecimpung lama di bidang-bidangnya, termasuk di sini Mas Gatra yang saat ini bekerja sebagai senior analis di ASPI. Mas Gatra graduate from ANU juga, S1 dan S3-nya. Dan tentunya semoga kita di sini harapannya bisa belajar banyak dari Mas Gatra bagaimana kehidupan studinya mungkin di ANU saat itu dan bagaimana pathway menuju karir Mas Gatra yang saat ini sedang digeluti. Sebelumnya kayak Christine sudah sebutkan, kita so this is the 4th expert series, right? The first was about how to have a career in consultancy, which is brought by Mbak Ririn from Deloitte Indonesia, and the second is from Mbak Alice from Pertamina tentang bagaimana stakeholder engagement. Yang ketiga kemarin baru saja dari Pak Denny Galan from Google. So this is very special because ANU menurutku tidak terlepas dari bagaimana ketertarikan teman-teman semua dengan dunia riset, dan ini adalah saat yang tepat untuk teman-teman mendapatkan insight dari Mas Gatra. Semoga acara ini bermanfaat dan semoga kita juga bisa have fun dan banyak diskusi sama Mas Gatra. Mungkin itu aja dari aku. Without further ado, aku akan kembali ke Christine dan juga nanti ke Riza. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Kak Intan. Thank you so much, Kak Intan. So, before we dive in, I would like to firstly, in order to guide our discussion today, mari kita sambut moderator kita yang akan memandu jalannya acara hari ini. Perkenalkan Rizal dari Coral Bell School. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and everyone, all of you who are already attend this event. Before we delve into the discussion, I just want to make sure, is there any of you who don't speak Bahasa Indonesia? Wait, okay. Okay. Just to make sure that we have an inclusive discussion, I will proceed with English. I hope all of you don't mind with this. And before we go into the discussion, I would like to again introduce our esteemed speaker here in our event. I think Kristen already introduced him as the senior analyst at ASPI, specifically in the cyber technology and security program. But other than that, previously, Mas Gatra also have some affiliation with some prestigious institutions, including Pacific Forum, Universitas Indonesia, and CSIS Indonesia. And currently, correct me if I'm wrong, Mas Gatra is also visiting fellow at Cornell School of Asia Pacific, where I also study. So basically, Mas Gatra is my senior as well here. Okay, our topic for discussion today is to delve deeper into the world of international policy think tank, because I believe many of you already have some experience working in think tank, or at least working with people who work in the research sector. And here we have people who are expert on this. But other than the professional profile of Mas Gatra, I think we all really want to know Mas Gatra as a person, like the personal story behind Gatra. So I think first, before we start our discussion, I want to know, what did you do, like usually when you were a PhD student here, and how that kind of activity finally brings you to your final role here at ASPI?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Rizal, for the intro. And let me just at the outset thank ANUISA for an invitation, and thank all of you for coming down here on a Friday afternoon when you could be doing other stuff. So to answer your question directly, I mean, probably, it's a good idea to sort of go back a bit, because I started my PhD in 2016, and sort of finished about 2021, 2022. And as Rizal has mentioned, right now at ASPI, I am in the cyber technology security program. I lead the program, the projects on cyber diplomacy. So those are things in the intersections of geopolitics, tech, and cyber. I have no training in cyber whatsoever. I don't know anything about computers. My specialty was in the intersections of comparative politics, political science, and international relations. And I did my bachelor's in Asia-Pacific security, which was in the past known as now it's known as international security. Did my honors, and then PhD in 2016. So I did my PhD looking at Indonesia's response to the rise of China, particularly after normalization of diplomatic relations in 1990. And it was very much a security studies topic, right? I've always been quite interested in the role of diplomacy, and as part of that, I did field work, interviewed a lot of government officials in Indonesia and beyond, participated in conferences and so on. But I only got into the world of cyber relatively later on, and it was sort of in response to the debates and discussions going on in Canberra about Huawei and 5G. So I was very much interested in sort of understanding how ICT policy making was done in Southeast Asia. So that's how I sort of entered the system. But as a PhD student, I mean, my activities were very boring, actually. I think some other PhD friends have far more exciting experiences than I have. I mean, some have done like fellowships at Yale, some have done like these amazing things elsewhere. I've only had affiliations with the Pacific Forum in Hawaii, but I didn't get a chance to go to Hawaii because of COVID. So, so I was stuck in Canberra. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was pretty boring.
Like basic pandemic experience, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, and by the way, because you mentioned a lot about security studies, right, and also your expertise in cybersecurity, I just want to just point out to some of our audience here have an expertise in cybersecurity, particularly here Mbak Fadila, who is currently doing her PhD on cyber and intersection with geopolitics. So of course, what you will say here will give so much impact. And about what you study in uni, I'm really interested. Do you have some tips or maybe some experience that you can share to us? Is it some activity that you think have so much impact to the point where it leads you to your role in think tank? For example, for me, back then when I was still in uni in Indonesia, I was interning in CSIS back then. And I think that is one of the most significant experience that brings me to work in foreign policy think tank finally in Indonesia. Do you have some experience like that, Priman?
Definitely CSIS Indonesia, which is, so I was an intern back in 2015, so about 10 years ago now. It was my first entry into the role of think tank. And that gave me the initial context necessary, as well as the initial training, really, and understanding how think tanks function. And all of that is necessary because, and I'll get to it in a second, because that got me opportunities and networks to meet with people in the Singapore think tank ecosystem. Now, if you work on national security, even economics, right, to an extent, we all know that Singapore, in many ways, is sort of the hub for policy engagement and policy think tanking and research, right, in Southeast Asia. So those initial experiences with CSIS was super helpful. Getting in touch with the academics here is super helpful because the academics based at the ANU, at ADFA, UC, to get to where they are, they go through a lot of things, right? And sort of being on good terms with them, developing a relationship, a rapport with them, supporting them for some research on some research projects can be super helpful in sort of not only exposing you to ideas about how think tanks work, but also getting you to networks that will eventually build up. Now, my Southeast Asia networks, for instance, was helpful for me for getting to ASPI because, when you work in a think tank here, you have to bring in some value, right? You can bring in value in the form of expertise, but you also bring in value in form of, say, networks. So people who understand Southeast Asia, who understand Indonesia, can be very valuable should there be projects on Indonesia, Southeast Asia. And when I applied at ASPI, as it happened, there was an interest in sort of doing a lot more work on cyber capacity building, understanding how, for example, we can build more, improve literacy on cyber norms as well as cyber policy across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, South Asia, and Latin America as well. So that's where I came in with my experience in engaging the Southeast Asian think tank community.
Right. Okay. We thought a lot about CSIS, like in our previous questions, and it is very interesting because I think some of the people here already work in think tank in Indonesia, but I think not many people here know what does it feel to work in think tank in Australia. So can you maybe share some experience to us? What is the key difference of working in think tank in Australia and Indonesia? Maybe is there like some difference that you think, this one is better and this one is like what we want to avoid when we work in think tank in Indonesia?
Well, one key thing is that like the think tank in Indonesia, it's not 9 to 5. It's very much it goes way beyond that. The way I've always seen think tanking, and this is particularly true in Australia, probably true elsewhere as well, is that when you're a think tanker, at the end of the day, you're basically wearing 4 hats, right? You're a researcher, so that's the basic. You got to be passionate about what you research. You got to know your stuff, right? You don't have to be a pure expert on it, a top expert on it, but at the very least, you need to be able to bullshit about it. The second hat is that of a journalist. And that again, it happens in Indonesia, but then in Australia, there's also that high expectation where you're able to sort of participate in the public debate and discussion, right? In many ways, think tankers help shape the discourse on things ranging from national security to trade. You have to constantly pop up in the media. There are high expectations for you to be able to produce, for example, quotes for newspapers or pop on TV, radio, and be responsive to things as they come up, right? And I guess where it differs from, say, some think tanks in Indonesia. So Australian think tanks are very much focused on themes and not on themes that apply not just to Australia, but also internationally. So I mentioned cyber capacity building. We do work not just on Indonesia, but also in Southeast Asia, Latin America, South Pacific, South Asia. So in other words, if there's a cyber crisis suddenly popping up in Europe or Latin America, I must be ready to comment.
Okay.
So that is perhaps the added pressure. Now the third hat is that of a diplomat, right? I've always believed that how universities and think tanks differ is that while you're expected to research on both hands, in a think tank, there's a much higher expectation that you are also an advocate. You got to be a policy entrepreneur, right? You got to throw ideas. You got to challenge ideas as well. You're expected to lobby. Not lobby. That's a bad word. You're expected to advocate certain ideas. A bit the same thing in Indonesia, right?
Yeah.
But again, I guess the exposure is much broader here, in that people come to Australia not to just talk about Australia, but to talk about the wider region. So that actually exposes you to some influence and impact over how, say, the Americans or the Japanese might want to approach Southeast Asia. And ASPI in particular, my think tank, has a very close relationship with the United States. So that adds some, that's sort of the added value. The fourth hat, and the most important hat, is that of entrepreneur. So you got to be really good at fundraising. The expectation is higher as you go further ahead, right?
Yeah,
So if you're a junior, for example, there's no expectation to fundraise. Although still, I mean, if there's no money, you can lose your job, right? But once you own a project, once you own programs, that's when you have to find money. And I don't know. I mean, when I was at CSIS, I'm not sure if this was I'm sure it was a huge priority for certain people, but then I don't think researchers were under as much pressure. Maybe in other think tanks, definitely under a lot of pressure. But here, I do spend most of my days fundraising, actually, especially at my level as a senior analyst. Yeah.
I really like the way when you highlight that we need to be generalist, but also having an expertise at the same time. And I think it is very relatable for everyone who already work in think tank, especially. I'm sorry, CSIS, for mentioning you again, but I often hear the story from our colleagues, of course, like Mbak Fitri, Mas Evan as well, who said that we have to constantly change our expertise because our expertise will need to adjust with the grants and the people who give us money. So I think it's really important to have an expertise and also to be flexible at the same time. And earlier you mentioned about how to make us having added value to the place that we work, and this is the part that I want to dig deeper on because I think we have a very interesting spot here. If let's say I were to work in Australia, because as an Indonesians, maybe there will be some expectation that we bring Indonesian expertise, or maybe like giving some insider insight that maybe people in Australia don't know. So do you have like some tips for us for us who want to maybe have a career in think tank in Australia? Maybe what kind of selling point that we can sell to them so that we can maybe become more prospective or maybe distinguished?
Yeah. So area studies expertise is definitely highly sought after. But as you know, like with think tank world, jobs highly depend on projects, the availability of projects, and it's very rare that you have a think tank in Australia that have a project focused on, say, Indonesia. It might be Indonesia and 5 other countries. So having a good understanding about how Southeast Asia operates is actually quite useful. But having said all of that, because a lot of the projects are thematic, it's also really good for you to know a thing or two about the broader theme, right? So, for example, if you are an expert on, Southeast Asia or say Indonesia, but then and foreign policy, you talk a lot about the South China Sea. That brings in maritime security. You got to know a bit more about maritime security. So to get into the Australian system, you also need to know a lot more about Australia. Your base, there will be other people who know more than you. That's fine, but you have to know the basics about Australia's maritime security policy, or foreign policy, or defense policy. So you bring in area studies is important, but then also knowing a bit more about maritime is good. So that's how I entered the field, not as an area study specialist, but as a cyber policy specialist. And area studies became a secondary thing, but super useful. Because then, we get, ASPI, for example, would get a lot of guests coming in from Southeast Asia. And it would be your task to sort of determine the agenda, to sort of maybe chair it sometimes. And these brings in, enormous opportunities because like you get people ranging from your average Eselon 2 to ministers. And even capres sometimes.
Can you mention the example?
Oh, we had Anies Baswedan from ASPI. We tried to get in Ganjar and Prabowo as well, but they didn't come. So
they should.
I agree.
Okay. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to remind the audience that we will move into Q&A session for the audience within 10 minutes. So prepare your question.
Oh, that's good.
Okay. and I will continue deeper into the topic about adding our value as an Indonesians who seek to work abroad. So earlier we mentioned about how we can engage into public discussion, right? And I see a lot of your commentary in the strategies and also other forum, which I believe like many of the people here already saw. So this is kind of like practical tips, but I want to know from your opinion for us who still becoming an academics here, especially for the audience who are currently PhD student, if they want to pursue a career in think tank, do you think it is better for them to spend their time to spread all of their work into like a more easy to read publications, like for example in East Asia Forum, or publishing in the Jakarta Post, or maybe the strategies in ASPI, or maybe do you prefer or is it better for them to do the the hard academic works like journal, book chapter, or something like that?
So this is cultural dependent, right? So think tanks generally in Australia are very different from, say, think tanks in Indonesia in that they're very much not academic spaces. I've submitted some papers to Indonesian think tanks, for example, that require me to send in a literature review. I've never had to write a literature review for an Australian think tank publication. So they're very different. The culture is very different. So you can write journal articles, but journal articles by nature are not as accessible as, say, newspaper articles.
Yeah.
I mean, now, even as an academic in Australia, there's a way to sort of measure your impact. There's an interest in measuring impact, right? I remember when I was doing my PhD, we were encouraged to, for example, have a Twitter account, to post more. Now, think tank, double that. Because the expectation is that you're able to shape and influence, again, public discourse. And when you write academic journal articles, I mean, you're adding to academic discussion, but then the policymaker at DFAT or Department of Defense is not going to be reading it. Because again, remember the goal is that as a think tanker, on top of research, you have a stronger advocacy role, right? So the recommendation is always to actually, if you want to get into a think tank job, write more in, say, in blog sites that are well read by folks in this community. Again, I'm talking from a national security standpoint, right? So for folks in DFAT and Department of Defense, they read the strategist, they read the interpreter, Lois interpreter. They would obviously read the newspapers. Jakarta Post is good if your goal is to influence Indonesian officials. So have that audience in mind, because you're not just writing for the sake of writing anymore.
That's true.
I mean, the thing is, I also come from an academic background, so I still like sometimes writing journal articles, even though when you get to academic conferences, it's a bit different. But like, when you're a think tanker, you have to think about who you're trying to influence now. And this also answers, in a way, your other question about frequency. Because you can say a lot, and that's one way to sort of get your name out there, but then, and make your ideas more known to the public, but then it also, in a way, exposes you to a lot more stuff, right? You may have criticized people you don't actually want to criticize, you want to impress in the future, for example.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to be tactical when writing. Having said that, I think if you're a bit more junior, I think writing a lot more can be strategic, although of course write with substance.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a really good insight, Mas.
Yeah.
Because I can
As an example, I mean, I knew about Mas Aristio from the thousands of pieces he's already written on.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I think we can kind of relate with that kind of experience as well, because I think back then when I first started my career in academia, I think actually the first publication that I did was not in news media, but actually it's journal article.
Yes.
But I think nobody care about if you were to publish journal article in Indonesia as well, right? Even though it is Sinta 2 or Sinta 3 in Indonesia. But when I published in
sorry, go on.
But when we publish in Jakarta Post, we have some footprint of you in this media, and so your insight is very relatable for us who work in think tank.
Yeah, that's right. And also, I think when you're shifting to a think tank, especially in Australia, it does take time to sort of move away from that academic style of writing.
Yeah.
If you look at if you look at reports from ASPI or LOE or any of the other think tanks here, like the US Studies Center or NSC, they all use very crisp, active language. Right. So what's the problem? What's the solution? There's no talk about theory, right? Because I think the ecosystem in Australia, folks are not as respectful of PhDs as they are in South
Yeah.
generally. It becomes a bit of a joke sometimes if you have a PhD, which is sad. But I think here they do value people who are able to get straight to the point.
Right.
Directness.
That's true. We are talking about commentary, right? And it reminds me that we sometimes make some controversial commentary. This is just some curious question, because I think there's Aristio. I think because Aristio was once publishing some controversial commentary about South China Sea. So I'm just curious about in your experience, have you ever made that experience when you publish some controversial piece? And if that is really controversial, how do you manage it then?
When you say controversial, I mean, that can mean many things, right? I think at its core, you want to challenge the status quo in a way, right? You want to challenge governments. I mean, in my view, and then let me just go back to ASPI's establishment as well. ASPI was established by Prime Minister John Howard in 2001 as an entity to provide alternative policy advice. So if you're constantly agreeing with what government is doing, then what's the point of having you around, right?
That's true.
And there was a senior think tanker in Indonesia who told me once that his method of measuring whether an article was good or not was based on how many government officials criticized it. So Doesn't mean that you give like terrible advice. It does mean that part of our role is to speak truth to power. And there's and this is the truth coming out here.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a sad evolution actually in how think tanks operate, because there was a time, for example, especially in the 60s, in America, where the home of the think tank in many ways, right? A lot of think tanks were a lot braver in criticizing government policy. Things are changing in that many think tanks are increasingly sycophantic. They become more pro-government, including in Australia. And that's challenging because, from a think tank's perspective, the idea is that you want to get funding, right? And sometimes funding comes from government. But yeah, we're in that period now where a lot of think tankers have to sort of adjust, and you got to be able to hedge and dance. How do you criticize without upsetting? That's a art in itself. How do you recover from controversy? I mean, I think if part of your task is to sort of critique government policy, you are basically criticizing or commenting on other people's livelihoods.
Right.
So you got to be able to stand up and take that criticism yourself, right? So it's one of the things that you learn as you go along. I mean, I've been relatively safer in that most of the things I talk about, like cyber norms, are. I mean, we can challenge, but then they're not so controversial that I get people chasing me down. I have colleagues at ASPI, and for those of you who are unaware about ASPI's reputation, we do a lot of work looking at great power competition, including China. And a lot of my colleagues look at subjects like Xinjiang. They look at things like Chinese information operations, and they get doxxed. They get people spy on them. Information about them gets spread on Twitter, and there's research on this indicating that if you're a woman, you're more likely to be harassed online. I mean, if you want to look as an example of this, Mbak Fitri and Mas Radityo from Airlangga University recently came up with a really good piece about Chinese and Russian disinformation operations in relation to the protests in Jakarta. There were people attacking them, the article, but most of the attacks were targeted at Mbak Fitri. Mas Radit. Yeah. So I mean, just as an example, if particularly if you're a woman, I mean, we have to be very, you have to be ready to face these kinds of critiques and criticisms. But as a community, we're naturally very supportive.
Right. Okay. I actually have so many follow-up questions with that one, but we have very limited time. But before we move to question and answer session for the audience, I think I have final question for Mas Gatra. And I actually forgot to mention this when I introduced Mas Gatra, but Mas Gatra was the president of ANUISA back then when he was a student.
With Rama, he was a treasurer.
Yeah, Rama here. So all the seniors. So we have
senior
treasurer, right?
He was the one guarding the Migoreng.
And who's the VP back then?
Oh, Billy Mambrasar.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Koirun Mumpuni.
Yeah. So we are not only doing expert series but also alumni live. Yeah. Okay. And final question before to the Q&A. Also, so many people here really aspire to work in international think tank, right? Even like me, I have like some aspiration if I were to have opportunity to ASPI. Please. So do you have like some tips for the student here, especially for those who are currently in their final semester? Do you have like some practical tips for them who want to aspire in the world of think tank? What do we need to do in our final months in Canberra?
So, I mean, again, my advice really comes in from the perspective of a national security think tank. And the things I say really come in with the higher degree of success bias because I got in, right? So, I mean, just keep all of that in mind. Firstly, again, be strong in your area studies. If you work on, say, Indonesia, I think most Indonesians, including myself, tend to work on Indonesia. That's why I say that. Specialize on a theme as well. So again, I specialize in cybersecurity and critical technology. You can specialize in maritime security, or you can specialize on terrorism and police and law enforcement. Now, all of this will give you an edge, but it doesn't guarantee anything. Because at the end of the day, openings largely depend on project availability. And if there's a project, for example, on maritime security that fits you, I mean, that's great. But then that might not be the case. And there aren't many think tanks in Australia looking at national security. There's only 5, I think. ASPI, Lowy, National Security College here at ANU, the US Study Center in Sydney, and the Perth US Asia Center. And with those two, you got to be good on defense. Perth and who is entering at ASPI now?
Where's Jessica, by the way?
Huh?
Where's Jessica?
He's being borrowed by the finance team.
He should have been here.
The town. I know. He's coming for the pizza. He said.
Okay, cool. Right timing.
Yeah. So there are 4 ways for you to get into a think tank overseas. Option A is through the internship program. And there are a lot of success stories, Indonesian success stories, where people try out for internship and then they rise up as a junior researcher and then become researchers themselves, right? I think Andreka Natalegawa at CSIS in the US is an example.
Oh, yeah.
There's another person, I forgot his last name, Zaki, apa gitu namanya. He is based at ISS in London.
I know Zaki.
Yeah, you know Zaki, right?
He was an intern in CSI. Sir.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think Evan bring him. Okay,
So
continue.
that's another thing, because like getting finding the right person to take you on board is really important.
That's true.
Now that's the first way. Second way is by experience, and this includes, for example, staying a long time in Indonesia first. If you think about some of the biggest names in national security think tank, Indonesian national security think tank, it's names like Evan Laksmana, for example, right? I mean, like the legend. I mean, but Evan only joined. He's now at ISS in Singapore, but he only got there after spending a long time in Indonesia. He's super active. So if you struggle to get a job now, say in Australia, immediately afterwards, doesn't mean like your chances are off. Just give yourself a couple of years, write more in the international press. Again, sort of broaden out your areas of expertise. Evan, for example, doesn't just write about Indonesia. He writes about generally military transformation. But Fitri, Dr. Fitriani, my colleague at ASPI, she's written a lot about cyber in Southeast Asia. There's value in sort of hanging around in the think tank space in Indonesia because, like CSIS, you constantly get invited to Trek 1.5s in Southeast Asia. This exposes you to a lot more people and exposes you to opportunities to actually be vocal about things. The third, and another think tank who spent a long time in Indonesia is Hilman Palawan at Lowy.
Yeah.
So he was at Setwapres, I think, for a small amount of time before joining Lowy. The third way is to sort of through the PhD track, but this is risky because it might not come in. I got in this way, in many ways. If you have a PhD, the assumption is you know a lot more. Not always true. So that's why they're more likely to hire you. I got it this way. Mas Adi Pragnarizky from at RSIS also got in this way. So that's another option. So it's only 3, not 4. Sorry. Yeah, internship, that experience, extended experience in Indonesia, and then jumping into the think tank scene, or the PhD and play your luck, try your luck.
Okay.
I mean, maybe that's enough.
Okay.
So a lot of things to know from that, right? PhD, internship, and also spending more time in Indonesia, aka not kabur aja dulu ya guys ya. So we come to Indonesia. Okay. We will proceed into the question and answer section from the audience. So please, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and please state your name and also your question. Okay, we will move first to Mbak Dila, please.
Should I stand up?
Of course.
How to train our mind to not get insecure, because sometimes because I get used to do the hard stuff like writing journals is really exhausting, but I get used to that and I am quite good at that. And recently I got published in Quartile 1 ASEAN Security Journal.
Congrats.
So and even get invited as a reviewer in International Relations Journal. So I'm good at journal things, but I'm not good at all at this kind of aspect. I do really want to be good at this as well, because honestly, I just only write 2 pieces of opinion. The first one it published in Jawa Post, and then the second one published in Carnegie Endowment for Peace. It is just because I've been invited.
Yep.
I'm not applying to my writing. I'm just being invited. And after that, there's no there's no invitation to write something. So, and I try to send some my articles to other newspaper, to Jawa Post. It's always been rejected. So probably there's something wrong to my writing. Why it always get rejected, while when I read the journal it always get accepted. Thank you.
Well, that's a question. So I'm actually the exact opposite of you in that I'm really bad at writing academic pieces. I get my mind just goes all over the place and it just never finishes. I've got plenty of journal articles that are not done. I think, how do you overcome that anxiety? I mean, it's really, it takes a lot of practice. Look, I mean, I didn't write that many op-eds when I was a PhD student either. I only became super active once I joined ASPI, and that was in part because of that strong expectation externally. But also, secondly, I think it provided me with that dopamine hit, and you know what I mean, right? And I think over time you just grow more confident. I think just getting that PhD really fulfilled my confidence, honestly. So how do you overcome? I mean, right now you're still doing a PhD, obviously. How do you manage all of that? I think having a peer who can sort of help you out, I mean, sharing your articles to people for thoughts really helps out. Especially people who are used to writing op-eds, and I'm happy to help out, for example, honestly, because academic writing and op-ed writing, sort of what do you call it, like mass writing or something, public writing, it's very different communication styles. You got to be direct, you got to be straight to the point. Sometimes you got to be bring in a bit of a narrative, so it gets challenging. The best word of advice I got from the strategist, the editors at ASPI when I first joined, was when you write an article, you gotta say the bottom line up front. This is a style. This is not a style that everyone likes. I mean, some people have their own methods, but it helps you sort of conceptualize the article a lot quicker. I think just what is it that you're trying to say, and keep in mind that an article is only 800 words, so you can only say so many things, right? Yeah.
Okay. Any other question from the audience? Yeah, the lady on the back. Oh, Jessica.
Yeah.
Okay. Please stand.
Hi, Mas Gatra. I'm Jessica. I'm currently doing my Master of Applied Analytics program here at ANU, and currently involved in one of the political science-related projects. It is more into trying to understand the framing used by interest group when they submit the pre-budget submission to the Australian government. And in this project, we are trying to employ the LLM to understand about the framing of the interest group itself. Because now LLM is a big thing, right? Like we can save so much of the money and resources into a project so that we can do more meaningful things when we employ the LLM. But I'm curious about how the LLM is actually right now in the think tank. Does think tank, especially here in Australia, really employ LLMs? Because as far as I understand, is that at the moment, lots of parties are still resistant against the LLM. Why? Because it hallucinates and it also acts as a black box. So lots of parties don't really accept them in the research, even though there are still lots of people are looking at it positively. So I'm curious, how does it look like at the moment in Australian think tank, and how do you think it will be in the future?
Well, thank you. It's a good question, and something that we've been pondering on ourselves, right? There is no one answer, and I think think tanks generally have different attitudes, but the general vibe, I think, is that to assume that everything has gone through AI. So that means that if there's a mistake, it's your fault. You'll be held responsible. So I mean, I don't know anyone who uses deep research, for example, to write their essays. I think that's going to be a bit too, it's a bit too obvious. And I think at this stage, a lot of us are sort of able to sort of go through it fairly quickly. But generally, there are certain projects that will use LM specifically because they're holding a lot of data sets. And I know some of the projects at ASPI do that. But for those who are not dealing with a lot of data set, like myself, the value that generative AI brings really comes in the form of writing things like grants a lot quicker. I think the industry itself has increasingly incorporated AI because, well, actually, let me just go back a bit. The impact of AI on think tanking is not that you have less researchers per se, but that you're expected to do more and meet stricter deadlines. This is a challenge in the long run because there was a time, and this is not AI, this is like something more, a broader external problem. There was a time when governments would be more than happy to give you $2 million or $3 million or $1 million for a project, and you don't have to look for money. That environment is changing, and now organizations and governments and companies are just after quick things. So you have to do a lot of fundraising. That's why I said earlier on, most of my time right now is just doing fundraising. You have to do a lot of fundraising, and grant writing takes so much time. I just spent like the whole day today almost just writing a grant. It's super exhaustive. Exhausting, and you only have time for research later on. So there's that benefit, I think, and how I think AI will be increasingly adopted by think tanks. For the most part, I think the think tank community here appreciates that think tanking requires a lot more than AI. Part of the traditional think tankers is, again, to bridge communities. The track 2, the track 1.5 dialogues, that still requires human beings, as well as human beings who are able to not only communicate, but network and advocate. So given that, I think the think tank community still is relatively resilient to AI. But yeah, I mean, right now we're incorporating a lot of our work because of pressure, time pressure.
Right. Okay, we have the other question from the gentleman on the back, Mas Tio. Yeah.
Thanks, Mas Gatra. Fascinating presentations. I really appreciate it. You I have a couple of questions. The first one, think tank will do a lot of writing works, How do think tankers measure the impact of all the policy papers that or op-eds that's published by the researcher? And the second is a think tank here in Australia trying to promote or influence the policy as well, not only the policy debates in terms of like what's being discussed, but in terms of like the practical policy directions of the policies of the Australian government.
Yep. So thanks for that. I mean, how do we measure impact? So there is no metrics for impact measurement, right? And I think in many ways you are constantly just yelling stuff out until it hits the window, until it hits the wall. But then organizations have reputations, and the research that they produce can have immediate, for example, again, impact is not the right word, but immediate outcomes in the form of, say, headline news. So in my program, in particular, the Cyber Technology Security Program, it's more known internationally than it is domestically because a lot of our reports end up in the New York Times, or the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post. Does that impact policy? Sometimes. So my colleagues have been able, for example, to raise awareness about the uses of slave labor in Xinjiang. They've been able to raise awareness about information operations against political actors in Japan, in the Philippines. That's grabbed the news. And when it's adopted by the New York Times, you have to respond, right? Will there be impact in terms of immediate policy change? I mean, who knows? I mean, some government official might say, we'll look into it. But more closer to home, like the work that I do on cyber policy, we talk a lot about cyber norms, and we support government officials in sort of drafting cybersecurity strategies, not just the Australian one, but also some governments in Southeast Asia, the Philippine government, for example. We sort of measure impact based on whether the things we say come in. And some of it can be a bit more generic. Other times, it's a bit more unique. So, I mean, I work a lot on economic cyber espionage. So when the country steal intellectual property from companies in other countries. We've been doing a lot of work in Southeast Asia on that subject. Some countries have now increasingly focused more on that subject. I don't know if we had an impact, but that would be something that we would try to promote, for instance. Contracts that we sign have a clause saying that at the end of the day, we are responsible for the outputs. But having said that, some donors might not necessarily be happy with the outputs. And ASPI has actually fought on many occasions with the donors. One very public one took place a few months ago when we had the cost of defense report, basically saying that the Australian government should be spending more money on defense. And the Prime Minister of Australia just said, oh, of course those ASPI folks will be saying that. They should take a good look at the mirror. So, even donors can be angry at you, and sometimes that does happen. In many ways, it is a bit of a dance. You still have to be very firm in your views, because I think, in my view, again, the value of a think tank is that we should be, anyway, speaking truth to power, right? There's still going to be idealistic folks within government who see the value of providing that funding. A lot of people might not see the value, but you can only hope that those idealists would, because in a democratic society, there is contestation, right? Contestation of ideas. That's a very broad response to your question.
Okay, and that question concludes our discussion today. Before we close our session, I would like to invite you to give round of applause to Mas Gatra for giving us a lot of insight. Okay, I believe like some of the audience still have some burning question to Mas Gatra, so feel free to reach him out after this. He will be around in Canberra, I think, still for the upcoming months. Please. Okay, I will give back the mic to Christine as the MC. Please.
Thank you so much, Riza. Thank you so much, Mas Gatra. Yes, it was very interesting discussion and very insightful as well. Maybe we can give a round of applause again.
Mas Riza as well.
Burning questions.
I'm just panitia.
Yeah, it was very insightful, and you made so many insightful points. And one of the biggest takeaway that I personally took was, I guess, how you have to know, especially as a student, and navigate what are the edge that you can bring to the table. And this is such a good opportunity. 2 years, 4 years of studying, this is exactly the place for it. And you can also meet a lot of experts, one of which is, for example, Mas Gatra over here. And this is something that you can obviously, look back and think back later on as well. And I think one of the biggest takeaways also to know exactly exactly the key people in the field. It seems like something that was underlying that you mentioned before, and I think it's very important. Well, thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us today. It was also very lovely to know that you were part of ANUISA and even the president of ANUISA. And welcome back again here.
Thank you.
So yeah, on that note, we would also like to remind everyone over here that we still have a couple of ANUISA events. Tomorrow we're gonna play badminton together after studying over the week. We're gonna have fun tomorrow at 8 a.m. At ANU Sport, and also on Sunday we're gonna have book club at UKimberg at 10 a.m. That's it for today. Maybe one more thing, we can capture this moment together. Let's have a picture, and after that, feel free to stare and talk around with people. And also we have snacks over there. We have pizza, so feel free to grab some. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.